Joining us right now is Ohio Senator Rob Portman, who's a Republican. And Senator, it's good to see you today. Thanks for being here.
Good morning, Becky. Thanks for having me on.
So let's start with the debt ceiling and kind of the showdown that's taking place here. Schumer and Pelosi have said that they are going to move legislation on this. McConnell from the Republican side has said, forget it, you're not getting any support from us. And I know a lot of us have kind of gotten inured to these debt ceiling talks. It's always a crisis. It always seems to get averted at the last minute. But would you vote no on something to raise the debt ceiling, which is basically just agreeing to pay the bills that we've already budgeted for this year? The Treasury Secretary says we'll run out of money in October.
Yeah, it is at the end of October, as you said, so we're not up against it. And typically we do wait until we are up against it. So this is putting the CR, which is the September 30th deadline, along with the debt limit. So it's not necessary to do it now. Second, Becky, let's face it, this is all about debt that has been accumulated since August 1st because we had a debt limit increase until that point. The vast majority of that is spending that Democrats have insisted on over the objections of Republicans. Remember the $1.9 trillion package that was passed in March. And now they're talking about $3.5 trillion, really probably closer to $5 trillion when you look at it honestly over 10 years, again, without a single Republican vote. So the argument is really quite simple, which is that Democrats have the ability to do this on their own, just as they did the $1.9 trillion on their own, just as they're trying to do the $3.5 trillion on their own, which is the biggest tax increase in 50 years, in addition to social spending that's probably the biggest social program since the New Deal. So, you know, that's what the argument is. I think it's a very logical argument. But the part that I like is that the debt limit actually forces us to make some of those fiscal decisions. In the previous segment, the comment was made about fiscal policy more broadly. I mean, you think about it, the only time we've actually reduced spending is in the context of debt limits. So that was how the sequester happened. That was how Graham-Rudman happened back in the day. So I do think, you know, it's the opportunity to have that broader discussion about the fiscal crisis that we're facing as a country.
What do you think might get resolved? You kind of mentioned harken back to some days when there really were things that got done in a bipartisan manner. It's kind of hard to imagine that today in Washington.
Well, it would be a bipartisan agreement to deal with the spending going forward. So the CR that is being sent to us is just to continue the level of spending from last year. Probably has a few anomalies, as they call them, or exceptions to it. But that's really not the answer. That would be kicking the can down the road for another couple of weeks, probably, maybe into December at the most. But we're not dealing with the actual spending of the country. So the 12 appropriations bills. So we have to have an agreement on that. And that agreement ought to come along with the debt limit. And we ought to be able to once again say, OK, let's put some caps on spending here, given the fact that we're approaching a $30 trillion debt in our country, given the fact that this year's deficit, again, is going to be near record levels. So, and given the fact that Democrats want to spend another $3.5 trillion in that context, despite the fact that the economy is picking up on its own. And if anything, the biggest concern in our economy today is inflation, as you guys talk about constantly. And the $3.5 trillion is just going to exacerbate that inflation, make it even worse. So I think it's time for discussion, and debt limit tends to be the place where that discussion happens.
Senator, the infrastructure bill and then the $3.5 trillion bill are still linked with some people, with Speaker Pelosi and others. At least that's the way they talk. And yet you've got Senators Manchin and Sinema. Manchin actually said, let's postpone it. Let's have a pause till next year. So I'm just wondering what the actual body language posturing is in your view. And let me just ask you, do you think that we actually do finally get just the infrastructure bill and that no human infrastructure gets done in 2021? Or do you think Manchin finally says, OK, let's do 2.5 and then we'll get that done and we'll get the infrastructure? Do you see a standalone, your bill, do you see a that you helped, do you see a standalone infrastructure bill getting done if no other bill is done?
Joe, that would be what's best for the country. There's no question about it. I mentioned inflation earlier. The infrastructure bill is long-term capital expenditure spending. So,
but
realistically, it's very possible. I mean, it's not in our hands, as you know, because the Democrats have chosen to do it with Democrat votes only. They put themselves in this bind, and it's not just Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema. It's other moderates in the Senate, Democrats, and also a number of moderates in the House. You know, the Speaker has something like a 4-vote majority, and she's got about 10 moderates who don't like the direction they're going. So I think they're going to have trouble doing it, and I hope they do, because it'd be terrible for the country. It not only raises taxes the most in 50 years, it really hurts our competitiveness, hurts American workers, and it's this huge new expansion of the welfare state that, frankly, is not timely. I mean, we are spending way more than we're bringing in already. So Joe Manchin is absolutely right. This is not the right time to do it. He's very concerned about inflation, and he should be, because he's talking to experts. Kirsten Sinema, as you know, has made her positions very clear publicly. She's an independent thinker. She'll do what she thinks is best for Arizona and the United States. And I think it's not unlikely that your first scenario could happen, which is that we focus on what actually works, long-term spending to help the economy, make it more efficient and productive, which is the infrastructure bill. If the president were smart, that's what he'd be pushing. By the way, he supports that. It's supported on a bipartisan basis. That would be a win for our country. It would be something that, frankly, we need right now, given all the other crises we're facing.
Hey, Senator, curious if you'd weigh in on the interest, or the issue, rather, of carried interest and the bill that has at least been proposed thus far. Democrats not effectively getting rid of carried interest, interestingly enough, but effectively making it a 5-year window for a hold period. Does that surprise you? Is that something you would support? Would you not support it? Some people also suggest that the way it's structured, it actually means that you'd have to own the asset for something on the order of more than 5 years to make it to actually get the tax benefit.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, Andrew, I was surprised to see the Ways and Means Committee report that out, because I thought that they were going to get rid of carried interest altogether, which is what they had talked about. And by the way, they also raised capital gains. They also increased taxes on small businesses, because if you're a pass-through entity, you're going to get hit with the individual income tax increase, which is pretty dramatic. So it's kind of a combination of a number of things. But yeah, I agree with you. I was kind of surprised that they didn't do what they said they were going to do. It doesn't mean it won't happen. In fact, I think it's more likely that the Senate Finance Committee Democrats, and here in the Senate, that they'll probably add that to it. I've even heard discussion, Andrew, they're going to do it in the Rules Committee in the House. In other words, they're going to add that to the bill, along with doing something on SALT, the state and local tax deduction. So we'll see. I mean, the problem with all this, when you combine it, they're kind of like trying to fit 10 pounds of sugar into a 1-pound bag, in terms of the spending. And then on the tax side, they're really putting at risk this recovery. And the recovery is going better than anybody expected, in a way. I mean, CBO, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, said we'd be back to about pre-pandemic levels at mid-year. We were. And inflation's our big issue right now, and we've got to be sure, and workforce. And you can't exacerbate those problems by doing more stimulus. That's the wrong thing to do right now.
Senator, is there any middle ground? And I'm talking basically about through the Democrats. If Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema, and the moderate Democrats in the House hold out on this, it seems like the progressives are going to come back and refuse to vote on anything lower than they'd like to see. Does anything get salvaged here if they get to that position and the Democrats can't figure it out themselves? Would there be an infrastructure bill that still gets passed, or do you think everything crumbles at that point?
Well, I would really hope the infrastructure bill passes. Again, it's good for the country, and it has a lot of priorities that Democrats and Republicans alike think are important. So, let's have a win for our country right now. I look at what's happening at the crisis on the border. I look at what happened with Afghanistan and what continues to happen in terms of the way in which the chaotic withdrawal caused issues with regard to evacuees that are now in our country. I look at what's happening globally right now and America's prestige, and I look at the fact that inflation is eating away at any wage gains that people are seeing, pretty much. So we've got a lot of issues right now, and wouldn't it be nice to have a bipartisan win and do something that's good for the country long term and puts us in a position to be more competitive vis-a-vis China and other countries? And that's what infrastructure is. So that's what we ought to do. President Biden supports it. Republicans support it. We had 19 Republicans support it in the Senate. So my hope is we can get that done. And if we do, it'll be a win for not any political party, but a win for America.
Senator Portman, thanks for your time today.